All right. Good morning, everybody, from wherever you are in the world. My name is Cyrus Jansen, and I want to welcome you to today's live stream. I'm very excited as we have a special guest in the studio today. This is Danny Haiphong, who is joining me from New York, and I think we're going to have a really great conversation today because it's really going to be exciting as there's a lot of things that we need to talk. I'm really excited to have a guest like Danny come on the show because he's bringing in a very new perspective that I think is going to be very healthy for people to hear. And one of the things that I really enjoy on this YouTube channel is having discussions. And I think for many of you, for example, if you've watched my last video, you will have seen that the comment section was incredible. We had over 2,500 comments coming in within the first 48 hours. Many people, expressing their opinion on this important situation that we see in the world with Russia and Ukraine. Many people disagreeing with me, many people disagreeing, but very respectfully, and also just wanting to further this conversation. So I think in an effort to continue this conversation and really, make it continue and really continue to blossom, I want to bring in another guest. And Danny, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to introduce you to my audience, to get them to understand a little bit more about you. And I'm really excited to sit down with you, kind of hear your thoughts about America, this thing called American exceptionalism, and how that really, percolates around the world, how that influences other countries, how it influences our own foreign policy, and then most importantly, as we're seeing it, how it relates to China, as you and I both have a very big interest in China, and then also now, with Russia and Ukraine. So, Danny, how are you today?
I am good. It's good to be with you, Cyrus. Good to be with your viewers and followers, and also to join them with my own at the Left Lens YouTube channel. So, good morning, everybody. If it is morning for you, good afternoon, evening. If it's evening for you, I'm doing pretty good, and I really appreciate your voice, Cyrus. Wanted to also give you an opportunity to my viewers because I always try to elevate voices that are really calling for peace, and especially peace with China, given the current geopolitical realities in the world. So, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important, and you know what? I want to as we're getting more people in the stream here today. I want every to send a message to everybody. Please use the comment section if you have questions you want to send in. Please let us know. We've got a super chat already from Trevor Norman who says it's going to be a good show, so please hit that like button. Trevor, thank you for the support to the channel, and agreed. Hit that like button, send in your questions because Danny and I, we have a lot of things to discuss. Um, Mansana, big support of the channel. Cyrus is a zillion times better than Tucker Carlson. That's a,
Good.
that's a nice that's a
That's
nice
true.
that's a nice compliment. Tucker, number one rated TV program in America, news program in America. Believe it or not, that's just crazy. Um,
Yes.
Danny, let's just jump right in. I want to know a little bit more about yourself. Tell me a little
Mhm.
bit about your story, who you are, what is the work that you're doing right now, what is the goals that you're working on, how it relates to China. I want you to kind of introduce yourself to my audience as this is the first time that you've been on my show.
For sure. So, I grew up side Vietnamese, Chinese, and my dad's side Irish, German, rural background, and I grew up there in the city, Cambridge, and I was kind of lucky enough to grow up in this post-Soviet period and struggles that people have gone through in the post-Cold War era, from the economic uh, crises that occurred in 2008, and experiencing how that affected my family, the amping up of racism during the global war on terror, and experiencing what that was like for everybody, but especially those racial and ethnic minorities and nationalities who were really affected by that. And then went to college. I was lucky enough to go to a school where I got to see like the deep class divides in US society,
Mm,
and how my experience just didn't match up with a lot of my peers', right? In terms of lifestyle and opportunities, and where my friends a lot of my friends from back home, what they were up to versus how a lot of my peers were growing up and growing into really prominent, powerful economic positions just because they happened to grow up in a certain kind of family.
Right.
And so that led me into journalism because I started writing for the school paper about issues of race, issues of class. And then when I graduated, right, there's this, it was post Libya 2011. The United States had intervened in Libya through NATO, which I know
Yeah.
we'll talk a lot about today, NATO.
For sure. For sure.
And
NATO's a big discussion for sure.
then the US was moving on to Syria, right? And this was sort of the first new wave of US interventions after Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was too
Yeah.
young at that time to understand what was going on. All I understood was that the United States was being very aggressive and that my dad was a Democrat, my mom was a Republican,
Yeah.
and they had differing views about those things. But my dad was very anti war, was in Vietnam, was drafted, and hated that experience for about a year or so. And he was very anti-war during the Bush years. And then I saw that a lot of people stopped talking about war, even during the Obama period, even during this Occupy Wall Street exciting period of talking about economic justice and inequality. But
Yeah.
this isn't really I was seeing presumably an African American president bombing Libya and then moving on to Syria and creating these huge refugee crises and destabilization campaigns. And so I started to get interested in foreign policy. I got really interested in ideas of socialism and anti-war politics, and that led me to my focus now, shifting into this new Cold War
Yeah.
onto China, because right at the tail end of the Obama period, about the second term into Trump, we saw this huge shift toward Asia, toward China in terms of US foreign policy,
Yeah.
this Asia pivot, and then now this new Cold War where China and to an extent Russia are viewed as these great power competitors, and a lot of military resources there. A lot of domestic policy is affected by it. A lot of the ways that people view Asian Americans is
Right.
affected by US policy on China. And so that was beginning for me, my interest in that was beginning to really be sparked in 2019, where the Trump administration was talking about concentration camps, talking about all of these propaganda points, Hong Kong.
Right.
And I was lucky enough to go to China in 2019, the very end, December.
Nice.
And then I spent 2.5 weeks into 2020, right before COVID-19 really started. It was actually, there were the first cases discovered, I guess, while I was there, but it wasn't really a
Right.
topic of conversation because nobody knew what it was. And I got to go to the western province of Xinjiang, and I got to see what life was like for people and to see the kind of infrastructure development, to see how China has progressed,
Yeah.
especially years since 1949, to see that, to see how tall people were standing, how much they supported their government, and how
Yeah.
much hope they had for the future, really sparked my interest in talking more about China, talking more about U.S. foreign policy. And over before that time, I had published a book, co-authored a book about American nationalism. So all these ideas about the US's inherent superiority, how it behaves itself around the world, and how it behaves itself within its own lines of nation really, I think, shapes how I think about things and how I have uh, gained a socialist perspective, meaning that I believe people, especially working people, have the power to determine how society is planned and developed. People should not be completely excluded from that process just because a few wealthy corporations in the military industrial complex, in the financial industries, that they want to
Right.
shape the world in their image. I think that that is incorrect. And I think that we need a different political system, have a political system that can support the interests, the desires, and the hopes of working people who are in the vast majority in the United States and most of the world that calls itself capitalist, European, Western.
Right.
That's just, that is the case most places. And here in the United States, it happens to be the most acute because it has this very rigid two-party system that really does serve just various sectors of the wealthiest parts of society. So that's essentially who I am. I've been writing for Black Agenda Report, a leftist publication, for about 8 years. I have
Nice.
been doing a lot more independent work on Substack, on Patreon. I run the Lens YouTube channel, and I participate in organizing campaigns like Friends of Social in London, myself. So, really kind of immersing myself in this media work because I think journalism is so far between, especially when it comes to these bigger questions around China. There isn't a lot of it here in the
Yeah.
United States. There isn't a lot of focus and attention in a way that promotes peace, understanding, cooperation, solidarity, and so forth.
Yeah, that's really good insights, and I really appreciate you giving everybody a little bit of intro to who you are, Danny. Your beliefs, what you believe in, and you've hit on some interesting points. And I think as we're talking about American exceptionalism, I'd like to give everybody a little bit of my view on it. And I think one of the things I want to first of all tell everybody that's really interesting is that I'm an American citizen. I was born and raised in Florida. I spent the first 23 years of my life in America. And I always say in my videos that I am very proud to be American. I am very proud of America. Now I want to be very clear on what this exactly means, because I've been attacked a lot because people saying how can you say that you're proud of your country, how can you say that you're proud to be American. One of the things that's important is, I've been living around the world for 15 years. I've been an expat for 15 years. And I think that's a really important job because as an expat, you are going around the world. I lived 10 years in China. I lived 5 years in Canada now. And I'm essentially this mini ambassador for America, right? I'm representing my country on the international stage. So I find it a very big responsibility as I'm, especially more in China, as many Chinese people, and I did a lot of traveling around China. I've been to 60 different cities in China. I've met many people who, for example, their first experience with an American was with me, in some rural village in China. And it's quite an interesting thing because, for example, their entire perception and their entire perspective of what America is like could basically come from their first interaction with me because they know that I'm American. So I think that I want people to understand there's a lot of good things in America. The country itself is very great. However, I have been attacked saying, how can you support the US government? Now, there's a big difference, right? There's a huge difference between being proud of your country, being proud of your land, and being proud of who you are, and then also supporting your government. And I think the government, for example, in my opinion, we are way too aggressive in many, many things. I think that we get involved in so much unnecessary conflict around the world. And this is something that I've been speaking out on, my YouTube channel for the last 2 years. And most specifically to China, as many of you know, I talk really about the United States and China relationship. I really find, and I think Danny would agree with this, there's so many domestic issues and so many policy issues inside of America that really need change and really need to change mainly for the people of America. I mean, there is a interesting dynamic where we have, we spend so much money abroad, we spend so much money on the military industrial complex, and they really dictate the budget of the federal government. Best example, I mean, we just ended a 20-year war in Afghanistan, and we've now increased the budget for our military. And so that's a really interesting note. And if you end a war and your US government increases the budget, that really tells you something. And it really, and we know the budget's only going to go up. I mean, that's just the nature of how our government runs. And it's difficult because I don't like to see us involved in all of these conflicts. I mean, honestly, I don't think that there's a war that the United States should have been in since World War II. World War II was the last war that America really needed to be involved in. And you think about all of the international conflicts we've been in the last, 70 years, it's a lot. It's really, really too much. And I think it's a really hard position I find for Americans because, there's a lot of Americans that unfortunately they just don't know anything outside of the country. And so you live in this echo chamber and you just live in this bubble which is called America. And your news is really, it's also interesting. I mean, like Danny, you're in New York, I'm from Florida, but if I was back in Florida, I mean, my world would really just be concerned about Florida. Like I wouldn't even know what's really going on in New York. And that's kind of an interesting thing is in the US, we have so much diversity inside our own borders that we tend to not even really to know what's going on in California, what's going on in New York. I don't know. I'm just concerned with Florida and my local politics and my local life here. And so it was interesting. I went on a business trip to Nashville, Tennessee last week, and I had told everyone I'm visiting from Vancouver, Canada. And I mean, so many people are like, "Wow, you're from Canada? Wow, that's amazing!" Like that. What's that country like? I'm like, it's our closest border. I mean, it's not like I'm from. It was just it was amazing the reaction because people were.
Yeah.
It's like I said, hey, I'm from Mozambique. This really far off, exotic country that they've never heard of before. I'm like, I'm just Canada's right across the border. It's our closest trading partner, the longest international border in the world. But so many people. I mean, like for example, in Tennessee, I don't think many people would have ever had a chance to go to Canada or know anything about Canada. I mean, that's our closest trading partner. So if they can't understand Canada, how are they going to understand other complex issues around the world?
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's very true. I mean, knowledge of American exceptionalism, it really does serve to close the worldview of most people in the United States off from what's happening around the world and the rest of the world. And I think it's because of the superiority complex that it imbues into those who are exposed to it, right? Because it is all about American exceptionalism is all about exceptionalism. It's about how the United States is supposed to be superior, how it's destined, ordained, even ordained by God, right? A lot of the first
Right.
as champions of this from from the early period, from Thomas Jefferson all the way into Hillary Clinton and the modern era political establishment. They talk about the United States as being ordained by God to be this empire of liberty, to be this beacon of democracy and freedom. And so when you hear these and then they're very abstract talking points, they're not really explained. It's not really talked about, well, how that is. And if you ask that question to most in the political establishment, they'll just say, oh, we elect representatives, we elect leaders, unlike those autocracies, right? That's what Joe Biden is calling China and Russia, right? They're
Right.
autocracies. They don't elect anybody. And that's not even remotely true. Not even
Right.
in China is that remotely true. But nonetheless, that's the kind of understanding that a lot of Americans get of the rest of the world. And now this question of how we view ourselves, American or not, that I think what's important to understand is that these are contested questions, right? And that there's a long history of how do you define what the United States is? And so what is there to be proud of? We're having this conversation on the socialist end of the spectrum here in the United
Yeah.
States. Like, do we be patriotic or do we not? I tend to view myself as not patriotic because I don't identify with the history of how the United States was formed. I don't identify with the slavery and the colonialism, but
Yeah.
I do identify, and I don't necessarily see that as this is being US centric. I do identify with the people who have been in resistance to all of this
Yeah.
oppression and how honestly they're really the engines of a lot of the innovation and a lot of the progress that has ever happened in the United States, whether it's around the question of racism, whether it's around the questions of economic inequality.
Yeah.
Honestly, a lot of the uh, gains, even in the areas of technology, it wouldn't have happened if there wasn't massive demands for a better life, right? And the United States feeling compelled during that World War II era that you mentioned, the United States felt compelled to spread the wealth a little bit more equally as it was building up this technological capacity to participate in World War II. So
Yeah.
for me, I think it's really important that we understand American exceptionalism as a contested question because there are those who portray the United States among the establishment in the media, the political class, the economic elites, those who really control things. Their American exceptionalism is about keeping things the way they are, right? And to
Yeah.
continue this status quo.
Yeah.
But that there is this history that we do need to remember that has not only fought that definition, but has tried to chart a course of, well, what would it mean for this society to be exceptional? What would it have to look like? And people like Paul Robeson, people like Claudia Jones, people in these social movements, labor, racial justice, economic justice, all of that have chart the peace movement have tried to chart a definition of, okay, this is, if the United States were to actually be exceptional, it would have to behave like this,
Yeah,
and it would have to take into account those who have been wronged, as well as where it fits now in this global uh, interconnected world that we live in.
correct. Yeah. You brought up a lot of good points there, Danny, and I want to talk a couple of super chats that came in. Kevin Tillstone in the UK, not enamored by today's topic as I'm focused on inclusivity and exceptionalism. To me, equates to divisive, and I think that's
Hmm.
really I think Danny and I would both agree on that point, and and that's unfortunately what we've seen with the U.S. and kind of this exceptionalist attitude. And it is you brought up a good one, right, where you said, it's maybe it's hard to be patriotic because of given our past. And I find it difficult. I'm in a very I find it very troubling for someone like myself who has seen the other side. I've been outside of America for 15 years, so I've lived
Hmm.
around the world, I've traveled around the world, I've seen the world's perception of America. If you're inside of America, you live in an echo chamber. You live in this environment where you believe you're number one. And for example, I mean, here in Canada, the reputation of the United States, just domestically here in Canada, where I live right now, has declined so significantly in the past 5 years. I mean, it's
Mm,
unbelievable how far it's deteriorated. And so many of these things can go back to Trump and really, him coming to power. And I think with Canadians, what's really interesting about Canada, for example, Canadian politics, it tends to be very boring, very dry. Most Canadians follow the U.S. politics because it's
mm,
a lot more
yeah.
exciting. Most Canadians here, they all have U.S. cable. They watch U.S. television shows. They listen to U.S. music. I mean, in many ways, all of the entertainment and media in Canada really comes from the U.S. in most ways. Canada is a very small country. It's 35 million people, and then in this
Mm,
entire size, 1/10 the population of America. And what's interesting is that you talk to when I first came here 5 years ago, I would be almost, I wouldn't say that, you'd be like, oh, you're American, Cyrus? Oh, great. We love America. It's a great, it's our great neighbor. And, we always look up to that. And now it's been like, oh, you're American. No wonder you're living in Canada now. Like almost
mm,
this, like, I know why you left America. That is
mhm,
because of, you want to get out, you want to come to our country because it's so much better. And I wouldn't say it's not why I came to Canada. My wife is Canadian. I mean, we actually moved here from China. I wouldn't say that we came to Canada to get away from the U.S., but it is this interesting perspective where, for example, when Trump was elected, many Americans said, "I need to move to Canada. I want to get out of here." And it's an interesting perspective. I want to talk about like what American exceptionalism means to me. I have an interesting story. There was a really famous tweet from Michael Pompeo, who a lot of people have brought up in the chat room today. If you're asking questions, I'm trying to take some notes, and we'll get to Q&A at the end. But I did have Trevor Norman send in a good super chat. Nice protest greeted Pompeo when he arrived on the Chinese island, but no mention of it in Western mainstream media.
mm,
Definitely wouldn't get a mention on mainstream media on that. As Pompeo pushes his agenda, we'll get into Pompeo and Taiwan a little bit later on. Um, but what was interesting, Michael Pompeo last year on July 4th, which is Independence Day, which is the national holiday in America, he said something along the lines of, congratulations to America, happy birthday to the most exceptional country in the history of civilization. And
mm,
it was really funny because it made me laugh out loud as I thought, wow, that is the most brilliant display of American exceptionalism. And so I
yes.
took a photo of that tweet, and I actually went around and I said, I showed it to my neighbor, and I'm like, hey, what do you think of this tweet? And I started asking my Canadian friends. I asked about 5 friends, and every one of them had the exact same reaction. Typical American. Like, they just laugh, they roll their eyes, typical American. And there is, one of the things I like to say is you got to give credit where credit's due. it is quite amazing to say, like, okay, America is a country that's only 270 something years old, and it has accomplished a lot. There's a lot of good things that America has done as well, which we can't discredit. That that and it is quite impressive. Wow, 270 years. They've risen to this position in the world. Yeah, that's fair. However, I think it's also a very dangerous mentality when you have this American exceptionalism, because I equate it to the story that we grew up hearing as kids as the tortoise and the hare. That America's the hare who, you think you're running this race and you're so far ahead of everybody, you become complacent and you become, you don't look for ways to innovate. And that's something that, that we see in America is we're always taught we're number one. This is the best country. I saw a tweet by a Chinese guy on Twitter last year. It was really funny. It was just something, do Americans literally grow up hearing that they are the best country in the world? That was the tweet. And I think it went viral. It got like 70,000 retweets. And
Mm.
I commented on that very early. And it was like, yes, we literally
Yes.
grew up hearing that. Like, that is 100% true. And people were like messaging me like, is this true? Like, you really grew up hearing that? I'm like, absolutely we do. Like,
Right.
like every morning, I don't know about you, Dan, like growing
Yeah.
up, I mean, I had to pledge allegiance to the flag of America,
Yep.
every day in the classroom, and we're taught, how and the other thing that's interesting as well that I really think is one of the biggest propaganda points of the United States is this concept of freedom. We
Mm.
really drill this into American minds, is that, children, you're free today in this classroom because our military is going around the world protecting your freedom.
Yep.
And I mean, as a child, nothing else. It's like, oh, fair enough. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you to the military. And we have this huge military culture in America, right? Like, any shop you go to, there's military discounts. You can go on a cruise, you can go to a restaurant, military discounts. We honor our servicemen. There's a huge love. Almost every sporting event in America, whether it be a basketball game or a football game, you're going to have, and everyone stand, let's honor our military. So, in every facet of American culture, there's this huge need to praise the military. And it's funny because when you talk about freedom, I mean, I'm here in Canada, right? There's no difference in freedom in Canada as opposed to America. Go to New Zealand, go to Australia, I mean, the vast majority of countries around the world have a very similar, if not same level of freedom as America. But we kind of tend to tell our domestically, we try to tend this message that it's some really exclusive thing, like, you guys we're the only one in the world that has freedom, this is why we fight our wars. And that's what people believe. And I mean, and that's where, where I say, no matter what the issue is, there's a lot of propaganda everywhere in the world, right?
Mm.
Domestically, internationally. So that's a really important thing. That's kind of my, one of my stories that I wanted to share about American exceptionalism.
Yeah, no, I mean, growing up, I definitely was encouraged. It wasn't forced, but most people just do it. Most kids, if you're a child, you're just going to do it. And it ramped up really, from what I remember, intensely during the War on Terror, right after the
Right.
U.S. invaded Afghanistan, and then subsequently Iraq, and all of the various measures that were taken that was backed up by this very hyper patriotic, hyper nationalist rhetoric and ideology that placed American exceptionalism at the forefront. And I think for me, in my experience, just as a journalist and just in my personal experience, I think one of the most dangerous aspects of American exceptionalism is the fact that it does hinder the capacity of ordinary people because of how we are all brought up within this system, within the same educational systems, within the same institutions, that American exceptionalism prevents us from studying history in a real objective manner, to be able to remember history in a way that can give us an actual view of the United States' development as an economic power, as a political system, right? That the
Yeah.
United States has not reckoned with its histories. And I think a lot of that has actually come back to haunt ordinary people, of course, day to day, people just trying to live their lives. But it is, I think, come back to haunt the system, the broader system, even the establishment, right? They've taken this uh, ignoring of history to its most dangerous conclusions, as we'll
Yeah.
talk about with ramping up these escalations with China, with Russia, ramping up this very aggressive military policy,
Yeah.
while also creating a much more repressive environment here in the United States, right? The war on terror did actually impair and diminish freedoms of all people in the United States. It did create a more intense focus on policing and on surveillance. And then you already had this decades long process of mass incarceration. And so a lot of the things that the
Yeah.
US leads the world in now happen not to be good things like mass
Oh,
incarceration and military spending. But if we don't understand our history,
yeah.
then we can then just adopt the talking points that explain away those things, right? Oh, it's
Right.
crime. Oh, it's we have to defeat and overthrow and take care of those dictators over there because they're coming for our freedoms. And I think another part of this too that's particularly problematic is the innocence part of this, right? And there's racial undertones to this and there's economic undertones, but there is this idea that American exceptionalism pr- uh, spreads to people that even if we do acknowledge some of these long-standing problems, even if we do acknowledge, let's say, the United States' economic wealth being
Yeah.
founded upon enslavement, for example,
Right.
and racism, or even if we do acknowledge, yeah, that the U.S. war on Iraq was extremely damaging both to the US and especially to Iraq and the world.
Yeah.
Even if we do acknowledge that it was justified because the United States' principles, its values, and what it stands for is correct. And I think that that is actually a pretty dominant trend in the sense that we're even seeing now with the Russia Ukraine stuff that people across the political spectrum are willing to support aggressive policies in response to something that maybe should not be involved with beyond calling for peace, but they're willing to accept aggressive policies towards other countries, even a no-fly zone, which would be disastrous for Ukraine, for example. But they would support that policy because the values, right, are correct, right? There, it's all
Right.
about okay, our role as a leader that is supposed to play this role of enforcing a certain notion of freedom, human rights, etc., and that the U.S. has the right to do those things as a superior country, as a superior entity, rather than a mutual player, as let's say a country like China uh, behaves. It's China says we're mutually here. We're trying to treat
Yeah.
countries like equals. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to promote principles, and hopefully, by our example, others will come along. The
Right.
United States takes the opposite approach of these are our principles, and no matter how much we maybe contradict them or even use them as weapons, no
Right.
matter how much damage all that causes, the wars and the surveillance and the worsening economics, no matter what happens, it's okay, right? Even Joe Biden said this in the State of the Union. It's okay because we've got your back. We have the correct values. We have the standing in the world. We're the leader of the free world. We're the leader of the rules-based international order. And
Right.
so we can just move on from those mistakes and continue to do as we've always been doing. And I think that's one of the really problematic parts about American exceptionalism and all of its aspects because it ends up being that ordinary people are taught, right? People who should be participating politically and should be thinking critically about their society. It teaches them that no matter how bad things get, no matter how much their representatives may not represent them, that the values that they set forth, what they represent, that is correct. And so we should just sort of be complacent.
Yeah.
And it causes a lot of confusion when people end up not wanting to be complacent anymore, right? Then it's like, where do we go? How do we get this history? How do we educate ourselves? How do we envision something different and something better when all we've been told is this is the best that we have and the best that we got?
Yeah, it's really it's a really difficult situation, Danny, because I think when you look at American exceptionalism and it how it influences our government, The problem is the United States is very much about making sure that people fall in line and that they
Mhm.
want to, you need to do it our way, which is a liberal democracy. And I think the most interesting thing about this is, this is why I'm so fascinated with China. And as many of you know, I've spent a lot of my, 10 years of my life living there. I study it every day. It's something that I have a lot of knowledge on, and I really like learning more every day about it. But it's interesting when you look back 50 years ago, right? It's 50 years since Nixon was, met Mao Zedong, and they really, established this, the relationship. And
Mhm.
there was an interesting thing from China in the sense that they were always open to the West, and even as early as the 1940s, Mao Zedong was reaching out to, for example, American diplomat John Service. Many people don't know that story, where John Service was an American born in Chongqing. He grew up in the streets of China, spoke a fluent level of Chinese. And John Service spent 3 days with Chairman Mao, in the very early days. This was before 1949, before the People's Republic of China was started. And even then, Mao realized, look, I want to get to the president. Like, get me. You're the only American that I have contact with. You speak a fluent level of Chinese. You can understand where we're coming from in our perspective, and we know that we need to, we need America's help to develop this country.
Mhm.
However, what we want to really do is, and I really like what China does, is they never go into other countries and spread their way of life, right? They never say, okay, you know what? Let's do a deal with South Africa. All right, we're going to do a trade deal, but you know what? We want you to adopt our communist way because we've proven that communism works in China. Therefore, you need to do the same thing. China would never
Mhm.
do that. And that's really phenomenal, because for China, really, it goes down to, why don't we just focus on trade, right? If we focus on trade and doing business developments, your people in South Africa will be benefit, our people in China will benefit, and this can really be the way that our relationship goes. And I think really the first Western leader that really understood that was Pierre Trudeau, who was Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister of Canada, his father, who established diplomatic relations with China 1 year before the United States in 1971. He had gone to China. He had spent time, with Mao Zedong, and he had said, you know what, Canada and China are never really going to see eye to eye politically. Why don't we just focus on business? Why don't we focus on trade? And we just kind of let politics be themselves. We kind of have
Mhm.
this understanding. You guys aren't going to be us, and we're never going to be you. And that's okay. And I thought that was a really healthy perspective, and a great way that I would approach the situation. But what we've seen over the years, and this is the problem, and this is, I think, what's really interesting, Danny, is we've seen China progress so much in these past, specifically 20 years. I mean, really a tremendous amount of economic growth, the poverty alleviation that's happening. The big thing is really the people's perception of, the Chinese people's perception of their
Mhm.
own government. Vast majority of Chinese are very proud of their government. They're very proud of what China, the country, has done. And the thing is that, they've proven that they can do it another way, right? They have proven to the world that there is more than one method to get the job done. And that's a threat to the United States, because all of a sudden the US has been preaching around the world, well, there's only one way to have economic prosperity. You need a democracy. And China's like, well, we can actually move much more efficiently and faster as a one party state. We can actually do policies very differently. And let's be honest, we have 1.4 billion people. We got a different society that doesn't really need that, right? And we're going to do it our way, because culturally, we also have a lot of different cultural points that are very different
Mhm.
than America. And so I think it's important to understand the difference. And that's really what I focus on, is cultural differences. I think if you look at, um, America, I wouldn't say that we need a, China system wouldn't work in America. That's just not how it's going to work. But I think, like you would be advocating, is we do need a bit of a more of a socialist mentality. And I mean, even here in Canada, I mean, we have a very socialist government and a very socialist society. The biggest difference here, Danny, is the fact here in Canada, we have universal health care.
Mm.
There is never a situation in Canada where a Canadian national will go into bankruptcy because they can't afford a medical bill. That that
Right.
that problem does not exist in Canada. And that is what a Canadian government would say, that's a human right, right? You should have access to that. And unfortunately, we don't have that in America. There are millions of Americans that are in debt because they cannot pay their medical bills, and it's just astronomical. The medical system in America is so corrupt. It is so is dominated by greedy pharmaceutical and insurance companies, and it's insane. And and
Mhm.
it's such an interesting thing because America, we have some of the most amazing hospitals and doctors in the world. So it's one of those things where if you have money and you're sick, you probably want to be in America because you can get access to the best healthcare and you can get access to the best doctors. If you have money, it doesn't matter. You can pay for it, or you've paid for very high, really good quality health insurance. But on a society level, it's very dangerous because there's millions of Americans that are uninsured and that will declare bankruptcy because they simply can't
Mhm.
afford healthcare.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, the US is really, I mean, it's capitalism on steroids at this point. It is a free, laissez-faire kind of society that really does privilege austerity, right? So unlike even past periods where there was a significant amount of pressure on the government to provide a modicum of a social safety net or a so-called welfare state, a lot of that has been completely rolled back by the forces of of big business and monopolies and huge privately owned banks that see everything as an opportunity for private profit, right? And with no sort of accountability to the broader society. And so I think that's where China has really set an example in the world that, as you said, is a threat. When Donald Trump and right started to talk about this quote unquote China threat, Mike Pompeo,
Yeah,
there was a lot of knee jerk reaction of, oh, hold on, there were some who were like, no, 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 China is not a threat, right?
yeah,
Because XYZ, all of these really good reasons, right? China operates peacefully. China wants to maintain bilateral relations, wants to uh, continue the era of globalization, isn't really setting out an agenda that is incongruent with US interests. There are some who said that, right? But what they don't, I think, acknowledge, those who take on this line, is they don't acknowledge that the United States does not want to see another economic system, especially one that calls itself socialist, right? A
right,
socialism with Chinese characteristics, doesn't want to see that system become so influential in the world that people begin to look at that system and say, well, what can we learn from it? And I think that's really the biggest fear among the US political class across the spectrum, whether it's
right,
Democrat or Republican. The biggest actual fear and the biggest perception of threat is the idea that China will be the biggest economy in the world, and that status changes. It changes everything. And not just
yeah,
because it's the biggest economy, right? It's not this benign, okay, China's just a big country, it's a big economy. No, it's also because China got there a certain kind of way. It got there by both participating in this global international system, this era of globalization,
yeah,
while also respecting the right of self determination, sovereignty, the UN Charter,
right,
and implementing that within its own context. So, both this policy of non interference that you talk about
yeah,
and also asserting its sovereignty where it is needed, whether it's on the questions of Taiwan, in Hong Kong, or whether it's in the economy, right? The way that private industry operates in China is not the way that private industry operates in the United States. Private industry in the United States basically has the full capacity to dictate political affairs and to dictate the direction of the country. While in China, private industry operates in China, but it has to follow rules and regulations and policies that allow China to continue on with its overall trajectory, its goals, its plans to improve the society, to become this moderately prosperous society, to become what it says will be a modern socialist country by
right,
2050. That requires a strong government, a government that can say, okay, we want to hit these markers like eliminating extreme poverty. We
right,
want to be able to protect people's lives when something like COVID-19 happens. We want to be able to invest in renewable energy, which isn't always profitable in the beginning. We want to be able to invest
yeah,
in infrastructure like high speed rail. It isn't profitable, especially when you begin. You have to really invest a lot into it before you get anything out of it. And when I was there, I mean, that was the most incredible thing for me, is to see that infrastructure, right?
Yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
a real testament to public investment in the well-being of people, and not just, although it does have these benefits, not just business. Although if you have a lot of high-speed rail, it is a boon for business too, because now you can get goods, you can get
Absolutely.
people to places a lot faster. The same with renewable energy. It may not be a boon in the beginning, but it actually is good for the economic health of a country, because now there isn't this uh, not only there isn't this extreme fear that China's government is not going to do anything about climate change, which is a real problem, but
Yeah,
also now there's a whole new industry that can be invested in and can provide amazing opportunities worldwide, because this is the
yeah,
move that everywhere in the world is going to have to take. It's everywhere is going to have to shift in this way.
agreed.
And China is leading the way in that, and it's just a shame that the hegemonism, this arrogance that comes out of American exceptionalism actually is so counterproductive that you had Joe Biden last year begin sanctions on China industry. I mean, that's how counterproductive this is. The US
Right.
is in desperate need of renewable energy, and China provides it relatively on the cheap. And the
Yeah,
United States says, nope, we're going to sanction that industry because of quote unquote human rights. And also, by the way, we're not going to invest in it either, because just like high speed rail and some of these other infrastructure projects, it's just too expensive. And Amtrak and these other companies, they don't want to do it. The lobbies, they
yeah.
don't want to do it. The energy companies, forget about it. They want to continue to pump the oil and gas.
Yeah, well, it's also hard when you're spending so much money on your military. I mean, we have
Hmm.
800 military bases around the world. I mean, we have a massive, massive budget, and so we're spending our money abroad on foreign military bases, and we just don't serve the people. And that's the biggest difference with America is it's interesting when we talk about American exceptionalism, because America is an exceptional place to live if you have money. If you're wealthy, and you're in that upper 1%, there's arguably no better place to live than America.
Yeah.
However, if you are struggling in middle class, you really feel that it's a very difficult place to live. I feel. I want to talk. Charles Chen, thank you so much for the super chat. Very, very much appreciate your support to the channel and to our live stream today. Danny, let's transition here because we
Mhm.
want to get on to Russia and Ukraine in a little bit. Before we do that, let's talk about big news that you and I both saw. Michael Pompeo in Taiwan as we speak. Many people are asking in the chat. We've had a lot of questions on this. What's going on with Taiwan? What's going on with Pompeo? Share your thoughts, Danny. What do you think about this? Michael Pompeo in Taiwan as we speak.
Well, I think it is a reflection of this broader US agenda with relation to Taiwan. There has been over the years, as you know, Cyrus, just an escalation, an increase in the sending of military weapons, of building a military partnership with Taiwan's government, which is in complete violation of the One China policy, of the joint communiques over the years, over the past several decades, since 72, during the normalization talks between the US and China. And it's really dangerous. We found out last year, right, that the US had been secretly training Taiwan's quote
Yeah,
unquote military, right, its local defense forces through its special ops program. And all of this, I think, reflects how Taiwan is one of the most significant chips in the US's new Cold War so-called containment strategy
right.
of China. And I think it's also because history, I don't like to say history repeats itself, but the US has had a long-standing policy toward Taiwan before normalization. And I think it's trying to repeat that process where it used Taiwan as this chip, as this possible point of navigation to pressure China to make concessions by fueling right now. What the US is doing is trying to fuel and support these quote unquote separatist forces, these forces that are currently in leadership in Taiwan, that do see Taiwan as a quote unquote independent country, despite the fact that nowhere in the world, other than a few places, a few small places, is
Yeah,
that something that's recognized. And even the United States refuses to openly say this talking point because of how badly it would reflect for global relations. It would be the US's own version of, like, let's say Russia Ukraine, where it did spur this and it did kind of intensify a geopolitical situation to the point of possibly a war, right? Because
Right.
I think Taiwan is the hottest flashpoint where any kind of new Cold War would spill over to a hot one because of just Taiwan's history with China, being a part of China and being now used as essentially a military satellite of the United States. And it's a really dangerous situation, dangerous position. And Mike Pompeo and the forces that were under the Donald Trump administration are the most enthusiastic about this because they really do see political alignment with the current leadership in Taiwan. They really want to see Taiwan uh, further and further distance itself from the mainland. And a lot of this is driven by the military industrial complex, in my opinion. A lot of this
I
is
agree.
driven by the
I agree.
fact that, right, every administration, the Biden administration approved hundreds of millions worth of military aid to Taiwan. The same happened under Trump.
Well,
It's a
our
bipartisan consensus to try to militarize Taiwan and use it, yeah, for these military companies who want to make a lot of money through this heightened conflict. China wants nothing, no part of it. China wants to keep the status quo and
yeah,
to continue its process of integrating Taiwan further into what is one China.
correct. Correct. I think that's a really important. You brought up a good point there, and I'm going to bring up a. I'm just trying to upload this right now. This is a really interesting uh, graph here. So yeah, when we talk about Taiwan, I mean, I think it's first of all, I think it's just absolute insanity that Michael Pompeo is in Taiwan right now. And the thing is that Taiwan is Pompeo. First of all, like one of my most popular videos actually was, the truth about Michael Pompeo in China. And he has, he over the years he has been such a China hawk, so
Yeah.
aggressive towards China. And the interesting thing about it is like you said, there's only 14 countries in the world that recognize Taiwan's independence. That number has decreased actually a lot ever since this new president in Taiwan has come to power. It used to be 21 countries. More people are moving away from Taiwan and actually moving to
Definitely.
China. More countries are down to 14 now. That's a significant decrease since the current president has come to power. And I find that we're in a very difficult situation because many people are saying, look, Taiwan, many people, let's say in America in the West, would be like, well, we need to go to Taiwan because Taiwan could potentially be the next Ukraine. And, we need to protect Taiwan. But the interesting thing is you have to look at it from the flip side. And the problem is that, you are essentially, Taiwan is part of China. That is a fact. That's something that everybody, every government around the world universally accepts. So you have this territorial sovereignty, which is this is why I find really interesting with Russia and Ukraine. China has come out and said, look, we don't support moving into another country. And it's a very difficult position for China with Russia Ukraine because they're
Totally.
essentially on the fence, right? I mean, they have a strategic partnership with Russia. Xi and Putin most definitely have a close relationship, but I find China's very consistent in that, look, we need to respect territorial sovereignty because that is what we demand of every nation around the world, right? If you want to have domestic relations or diplomatic relations with China, you must, adhere to the one China policy, which we all do. And we all recognize that Taiwan is part of China. And so now you have the US, for example, you have, Pompeo who's going there and he's pushing his ideas. And I think it was just so irresponsible for him to suggest, oh, what we should do, why don't they just go ahead and declare independence.
Mhm.
And the biggest thing is, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a screenshot here. This actually goes against what people want. Okay, so this is a recent survey from Taiwan, and you can see that the black line, okay, 28% of Taiwanese, okay, are saying that they would like to maintain the status quo. Let's decide at a later date. Okay.
Mm.
Now another 27% are saying that maintain the status quo indefinitely. Okay, so there is and then you have the green line, which is 25%, which is maintain the status quo, but let's move towards independence. So the vast majority of Taiwanese are really talking about status quo, at least for the foreseeable future,
Right.
with a large portion of that saying, that we want to, probably forever, want to have this maintain this status quo. You look at the bottom of this graph, how many people really want independence right now? We're talking 6% of Taiwanese would want independence. right? So you have somebody like Michael Pompeo who's going to Taiwan and really speaking out for the 6%. Now there's 1.4% would say I want to reunify as soon as possible. So this is the thing that is just so nuanced about Taiwan and that really needs to have a lot of discussion. Is we look at you look at the fact of this graph, it really shows you Taiwanese people really want to have the status quo. I mean, that graph, and that's a graph that was done by a Taiwanese company in Taiwan for Taiwanese people. This is not the United States. This is not a China graph. Let's go right to the source. Let's talk to Taiwanese people. And I think the status quo really works well. It's a great status because it allows both parties, both Taiwan and China, to be happy. It's functioned for a long time. And, there really isn't a point for Pompeo to go there and to say this. I find it very irresponsible. I find it extremely reckless. And we know that, for example, the only way that I will see China, let's say, invading Taiwan. I mean, it was interesting. As soon as Russia-Ukraine broke out, Taiwan's trending on Twitter. I had friends that don't really know a lot about China, here in Canada. Oh my God, is China going to attack Taiwan today? Of course not. There's no chance at all that China is going to attack Taiwan because there is no threat. Taiwan is already part of China. The only threat is that I would see is that, let's say that I see a scenario like this falling out. Let's imagine that the United States decides to surround United States warships around Taiwan, and they set up, a permanent military base, or they give this Taiwanese president confidence to say, okay, you know what, go ahead and declare your independence. We got your back. Now, as soon as that scenario folds out, then you have, the United States interfering in the sovereignty of another country. And this is something that, that can't happen. This is a question that I've got a lot on it, and I'm going to transition this to Russia, Ukraine now.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been, I made a video recently that has been, has received a tremendous amount of feedback. And I'll be honest, most people disagreed with my stance on Russia, Ukraine. Most people, and what was quite amazing, Danny, was I had a lot of people respectfully disagree, right? They had, if you look at the comment section, it was actually quite amazing because so many people wrote deep, well-educated, just very constructive comments. So I really appreciate all of my fans that, that are part of this community. And the interesting thing is that a lot of people had asked me, Cyrus, all of us, we watched that video and we are under the impression that you support the United States, invasions around the world, that you support this expansion, you support NATO expanding. And I want to just clarify my position. For example, I do not support what America did in Iraq. We lied to the public. We lied about weapons of mass destruction. We invaded a sovereign nation. And that would be very similar to the scenario that I just described with Michael Pompeo. I don't support the United States doing that either. And like I've said, if you watch my videos on this channel, I've always said we need to work domestically on our issues in America. We have a plethora of things that we can fix. And as an American citizen, I would be like, let's be a little bit selfish. Like, let's focus on us only for a bit. I want my politicians to be focusing on, domestic issues here. And I mean, we even see that in Canada. We had a local politician here in Canada. And in Canada, the system's a bit different. We have members of parliament. So you don't vote for the prime minister in Canada. You would not get a vote for the leader. You would vote for your local your member of parliament. And he was knocking door to door. And one of his key campaigns was, our goal as the Conservative Party in Canada is to spread democracy around the world. And I'm like, whoa. That's a huge issue for me. And he's like, why? Why is that an issue for you? And I said, you literally work in the southeast side of Richmond, British Columbia. I want you focusing on stuff here. Why am I supporting you to go around the world and spreading democracy? Why are you literally service a very small area of Canada. That's where your focus should be, like that. You've got to focus on, I'm like, I want you to focus on me. I'm a little selfish here. Like, don't you think that as my local representative, you should be focusing on what are our school issues, our tax issues, our community parks, all of these things that affect our daily lives here in Canada. That's what your job is as a local politician. And so, we see this tendency even here in Canada, to this, a bit of exceptionalism. So I've gone on a while there, but Danny, I want to ask you a question. Tell me about your stance on the US, NATO, and how that affects Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, no, this has been a really hot question. And I do see what we were talking about before with Taiwan, Pompeo's visit, the timing of it. There, with all of that rhetoric and all of that reaction coming out regarding China and Taiwan after Russia announced its military operation, I think that there is sort of a coordination going on, right? I think there is this desire to kind of build up to a similar scenario, right? Where China feels compelled to have to intervene in Taiwan. And that is so dangerous. I mean, we're talking about a similar situation, right? The threat of a global confrontation, a world war, of a third world war potentially. And
Right.
so I do see that as part of the pressure campaign of like, yeah, goat President Tsai into announcing independence, right? Try to scratch that itch to the point where it happens, and then
Right.
you can put China into a Russia-Ukraine situation. And, China, of course, would never take the bait. And I think,
Yeah.
for one, I think it's important to look at China's position because China has, even before this intervention, right? Russia and China came out with a joint statement. They were categorically and just very firmly against NATO's continued existence. That has been a position that has continued to develop not only among China's foreign ministry, but also in Russia and in a lot of the world, right? Because there is this huge contradiction of having an institution like NATO, which was formed in 1949 in response to the Soviet Union after World War II, as an attempt to contain quote unquote communism and mostly the Soviet Union, right? To have that bulwark in Europe to stop the spread, right? That was what NATO was supposedly all about. And during negotiations with Mikhail Gorbachev, right, the United States and Europe promised him that if he were to allow Germany's reunification, that beyond Germany, NATO would not expand eastward. And
Yeah.
since then, 14 countries have been admitted, including countries like Poland, that sit right on Russia's border
Yeah.
and create a very dangerous security situation where a possible first strike nuclear conflict could occur based on some kind of error, right? Just something as small as that could cause a threat to Russia's very existence. And
Yeah.
so Ukraine has been part of this, right? Because for decades, Ukraine has been spoken about as a de facto NATO country, that it will be eventually in NATO, and that many establishment figures in the United States, from the current CIA director, William Burns, who used to be the US's ambassador to Russia, has said that this is very dangerous, that eventually Russia will respond. Once it's in a position to respond, it will respond because the more countries that are admitted and countries that are right along Russia's borders are admitted, it creates this feeling, which is very legitimate because NATO has as its mission a deterrent effect. Who are you deterring, right?
Yeah.
And while many won't say directly Russia, there have been many who have said, yes, it is Russia, including
Right.
Donald Trump and the
Yeah.
national security strategy of the United States being all about containing China and containing Russia. So NATO moving and encroaching has this effect. And Ukraine has been part of this for many years. And so my position on this is that I do believe, right? We can't know this for sure because there
Yeah.
haven't been clear statements, but Russia's foreign ministry, Vladimir Putin, have been clear that they have been seeing the situation as very dangerous for a long time, even just
Correct.
back in December, right?
Yeah.
Placing missile systems, right? The potential of placing missile systems in Poland and the potential of doing that in Ukraine is a red line. It cannot happen without
Yeah.
Russia saying, okay, that is a threat to our national security, and we will take equal and congruent action.
Right.
And so, one of the things that I think is often left out of the conversation here that should be discussed is how Ukraine itself, since 2014 and the government transition there, the coup that the
Yeah.
US supported directly, since then, there has been a civil war in Ukraine that has been happening actually right along Russia's border. So the
Right.
Donbass region is on Russia's border, and there have been more than 10,000 people. I think it's roughly 14,000 according to UN numbers,
Yeah.
most of which are Russian-speaking people who identify with Russia, who have a lot of connections in Russia,
Yeah.
who because borders are so porous and political in nature, could be considered Russian, and so to speak. And that
Correct.
has been happening without response from Russia other than clamoring for, saying that there needs to be a demilitarization. And Ukraine's president in 2019, when he was elected, Volodymyr Zelensky, campaigned on this, that I will demilitarize, that I will de-escalate, that there
Right.
needs to be a less. He didn't go so far as to say we're going to be friendly with Russia and have go back to maybe the status quo before the coup, where
Right.
we will have a more balanced approach. But he said, I will de-escalate. This is untenable.
Right.
And since then, his administration has actually just worsened the situation, tore up the Minsk Accords, did not follow them as he said he would.
Right.
He allowed the fighting to continue and is even now, right, amidst this conflict, supported some of these far right forces, neo-Nazi forces, to an even greater degree than it was already happening underneath the surface and not really being paid attention to. So my opinion is that while I cannot say, because I don't think we have the full story yet, that Russia's intervention is justified, right? I do think that there is a violation of the UN Charter going on. There
Right.
are also a lot of factors that really did push Russia against the wall that's been happening for years, from the NATO expansion all the way up to the borders of Lithuania, of Latvia, Estonia, all the way up to the borders of Russia, Ukraine. The coup in 2014 created a very hostile security situation as well. And Russia was never listened to, right? I think this is another thing, is that
Yeah.
there was never any good faith attempt from the United States, the EU, NATO, to take Russia's security concerns seriously and to take what it said was, we will respond politically and militarily to threats that are posed against us. We will respond. They were never taken seriously, right? NATO, freezing NATO's expansion, demilitarizing Ukraine, stopping the flow of foreign arms into Ukraine, right? These very reasonable requests, which weren't like they weren't asking for a reversal. They were just asking for a ceasefire, so to speak.
Right.
Stop fueling the flames. And that was never taken seriously. And it was really the United States that was spearheading the attempt to portray Russia as just this like demonic evil that was just aggressive. We heard for months, Russia's about to invade, Russia's about to invade,
Right.
while the US was sending weapons to Ukraine, and Ukraine was mobilizing troops on the border as well, right?
Right.
We had this powder keg that was developing, and
Correct.
the United States, with the power to end the war, to end any possibility of a war, didn't do it. So I think that because wars are always about many sides, of course, Russia responded strategically in a way that I think, definitely violates the UN Charter. And that's why China takes a neutral position. China is
Correct.
not going to punish unilaterally Russia. That would be politically,
Correct.
economically, just against all of its interests, and also against the UN Charter as well. You don't resolve global conflicts by creating more war and facilitating
Exactly.
more war. You don't say, okay, Russia, you're doing something wrong, so we're going to now starve you. That's what the United
Yeah.
States is doing. We're going to starve you into submission. We're going to make your economy bleed, and we're
Exactly.
going to try to achieve our own interests. No, China is saying, we need to respect the UN Charter here. We want to be mediators in this conflict. We want peace, and we also want to make sure that everyone's concerns are taken into account. And right
Yeah.
now, the dominant trend is that Russia's are completely removed. They're completely erased, suppressed, minimized, outright disrespected, and it's become even like a race war, right? Racism
It
has been
has.
deployed in the media to make
Absolutely.
Russia look like this Russian imperial kind of like, we're going to take over the world, and this is our kind of like the first shot fired,
Yeah.
while Ukraine is Europe, not in the EU, not in NATO, but
Right.
now it's Europe now, right?
Exactly.
Treated like a second-class country, right?
Yeah.
Sponsoring a coup in a country, then trying to dictate its politics from the outside, which it has done, unfortunately, pretty successfully.
Yeah.
That is not really how a European country is treated in the realm of international politics, given the way that the U.S. has operated since World War II, really. So it's some of this is irony, but I think my position is that in order for this conflict to really end, because I don't know where it's going to go, I
Yeah.
do think that there probably will be a cessation of open hostilities, right? relatively soon. I can't predict that, but it seems like this situation can't last forever, right?
Right.
Russia cannot continue to engage the way it is for over a long period of time. Ukraine is not really in a position to handle what's going on either. And then you have the bigger factors here, US, Europe, really placing themselves in a very contradictory position of fueling the war, trying to keep it going, while also placing almost these suicidal sanctions, which will affect Europe's and the US's economy to such a great degree that we could have another economic collapse crisis very soon
Yeah.
if Russia is sanctioned to the point where it can't get gas to Europe and the United States starts to flood the market with its own. That will create such economic shockwaves that aren't sustainable.
Agreed.
And I think that while we may see that, the root causes of the problem will persist unless there is a monumental, and it seems counterproductive, and it seems like on the surface that this isn't the case, right? That it's just Russia invading. But unless the United States and NATO begin to take seriously the threats and the dangers of its own actions and are forced to reverse course, we won't see Russia and Ukraine be able to work out their differences
Right.
because Ukraine will be under heavy influence from the US and all of the forces that it has supported inside of Ukraine, which might be a minority of the country, but have undue influence, right? These far right wing parties, these far right wing security organizations, paramilitary groups, they have a lot of power right now. They have
Right.
almost de facto control of the National Guard and the security forces. It's really dangerous because that tiny minority of the population wants to see a war with Russia. They see it as like a holy war. This like
Right.
we're going
Yeah.
to beat back Russia culturally, right? We're going to that is a disaster and creates just so much unnecessary problems that could be resolved tomorrow if the United States did what international law really does uh, uh, tell it to do, which is stop fueling the war and allow Russia and Ukraine to talk, right? And I
Yeah.
think I think if that were allowed, China, Russia, and Ukraine could come together in a matter of minutes and begin this process. But I do
I
see US and NATO as being just so much at the forefront of this that we have an obligation, I think, for me as a peace activist and a
yeah.
socialist and a journalist, it's like I have an obligation to give that story because I don't agree with war. I don't necessarily know if I agree with the intervention just yet. I don't know. I don't know if it's necessary, but I do know that it was egged on and that there were so many pressures that in a new Cold War, you're going to see this. And we saw it in the 20th century, so many instances of this, and we're seeing it now in the 21st century, kind of like the first almost like the first great power, not being the United States, respond in this way, and we may see more of it
Yeah.
if these questions aren't given their proper attention.
Yeah, good point there. I want to first of all give a little shout out to Chun Ling Tong and TH Tan for their super chats they sent earlier. Guys, thank you for supporting the channel. And we've got over 800 people now in the stream, Danny, to combine. So it's been a
Cool.
really great stream. A lot of people joining in here, and I'm really excited to chat about this because it's our world is so interconnected. I mean, I'm one that my channel focuses on fostering better relationships around the world. Right, I'm
Hmm.
one that have advocated for a better relationship between China and the United States. As many of you know, I often state when these two countries work together, the world's going to win. I really that the main goal with my last video actually was to really highlight the unique opportunity that China has in that they are the mature one, that China most always will choose the path of of avoiding war. China does not like conflict. They're not a country to go into other nations to try to conquer and divide. They're not a country that goes in trying to install their form of government. China very much is a very peaceful country. It's also one
Hmm.
that just wants respect. Let us do what we want to do, right? And let us do. You do you. We'll do us. And that's how China. That's really their foreign policy. And I have a lot of respect for that. I have a lot of respect for respecting others and the respective governments that they have. I think China is in a unique position, being close to Russia, and I do recognize, the huge role that the United States and NATO, brings to this discussion, and how much they have escalated this situation. Again, I do maintain my stance as far as that. I do think that this response from Russia is too much. I'm very anti-war, and I think part of the reason why I'm so anti-war is because I am American, and I've seen the colossal mistakes that the United States government and military have made over these past 70 years, and all of the conflicts that we've been involved in. And while I understand Russia's position, I just wish that diplomacy, that there's other ways to go about. And like I think you said right there, I think that really hinges on now the United States and NATO coming to the table. Maybe China needs to get involved as well. Russia, Ukraine, maybe everybody needs to sit down. I mean, there needs to be some type of ceasefire. There has to be an exit from this. And I don't know what that is. I mean, potentially some of the ways that this ends would be, obviously, I think certainly US and NATO coming to the table saying, look, we're going to retreat. I think the chances of that are very unlikely, though. Like what I mentioned with Russia invading, that's only going to fuel more of, Ukraine's westernization. I think NATO is only going to justify, well, now we need to expand. So it's kind of this chicken or egg thing, like what came first? Was it NATO's expansion, or was it Russia's actual invasion? What has pushed us to this point? I'm very pessimistic about the US and NATO doing that, because we know that they just want to expand. That is their MO. I think what would be another solution? Is it really to section off the Donbass region? Would it be to annex that, similar to Crimea, and really turn that back into Russian territory? Would that be enough for Putin? Would Putin accept a neutral Ukraine? I brought that up in my last video. Is that something that Putin would be happy with? I don't know if he does he really want to control all of Ukraine just to make sure that there's no military threat to him and Russia in the future? I don't know. There's so many questions, and I don't know. I don't have the answers. I don't think anybody does. I think all of us. I think Danny, I'm pretty sure you'd be you're not in favor of a war that's happening right now, but you do recognize what's the forces and the many different things that are in play here. So it's a very difficult time. I think for all Ukrainians. I think for all Russians as well. These sanctions have been unprecedented. Many people have asked me, Cyrus, why doesn't the U.S. get sanctions when they invaded Iraq? Unfortunately, who can sanction the U.S.? It's really, and that's really the problem there. I mean, yeah, I agree. Again, like I never supported the Iraq invasion. Weapons of mass destruction is just a lie. One of the best movies, if you haven't seen it, is Vice. If you haven't seen that movie Vice, that talks about Dick Cheney and how it's a brilliant movie played by Christian Bale. He plays Dick Cheney, and it really just goes behind the scenes to show you what happened. And I mean, even from as far as, you look at how far the U.S. went. They did a public poll, to see which of these leaders, which position in the U.S. government had the most trust factor, in the public opinion in America, and that was Colin Powell. Colin Powell. They said, basically, if George Bush gets up on stage and says this, not a lot of people are going to believe him, but you're a general, Colin Powell, and America's perception of you is very high. You're very trustworthy. We did surveys and we did independent studies, and we found that almost 80% of Americans believe you to be a trustworthy guy. Therefore, are you going to step up and do this for your country? And even in that movie, he's there and he's like, well, I don't really feel comfortable doing this. It's and then there was a point where Dick Cheney walks over and he's like, well, George, what are you going to do? Are you going to make this war happen or what? Like, you need to force him to do this. And Colin Powell was very much basically, you either toe the line and do this or you're out. And so he did that, of course, went to the Congress and said, look, we have weapons of mass destruction. Everyone believed it. We went and invaded. And Colin Powell, on his deathbed last year, I believe he passed away last year, he said it was the biggest regret of his life was telling that lie. And so there's just there, and I mean, that's horrible. And unfortunately, we're sold on this. And again, it goes back to where we started this conversation, American exceptionalism, because like I said, 7-year-olds that are in grade 2 in America are being taught, children, the reason why you pledge allegiance to this flag is we've got our military around the world fighting wars so you can be here in America having freedom. And it goes back to that propaganda that we have within America
Mhm.
about freedom, and that we think of it as it's some exclusive thing only attained in America, where, and I've made videos about this before. I think if you ask a lot of Chinese people in China, I think they would say, I feel very free. There's a lot of
Yeah,
freedom in China. It's a perception. Yeah, you can't
yeah,
do the exact same thing in China that you can in America, but that doesn't mean that there's not freedom there. And freedom is valued very differently around the world. And that's why we go back to one of my points is talking about culture and understanding this. In America, you can go out and say, let's go Brandon, or F, Donald Trump. You can poster that all over your car. You can say whatever you want, but there's a cultural thing, right? In China, there's a culture of meritocracy, of respect. Chinese people wouldn't necessarily want to have that freedom to go out and say something bad about their president. It's like, well, that's my president. I support him, and we need to show him respect. And so,
right.
yeah, I'm kind of rambling here, but those are some really important points that we go. And I like how we've kind of tied this all together, Danny, into
Yeah,
this topic of American exceptionalism. And
totally.
yeah, I mean, I'll let you add in some more things, and then, guys, why don't we? We're coming up to, let's say we want to keep this right at 90 minutes, so let's do another
Yeah,
10 minutes,
sure.
and let's say, um, Danny, I'll let you add anything you want to add in there, but then also anybody, if you'd like to ask some questions for Danny or I, please send them in. Please send them in right now. We'll take questions for the last few minutes here.
Yeah, what you described is really good in terms of I think there's a fundamental difference in the relationship that people have with their governments in the United States and China, and that, people really expect in China for the government to serve them and to do certain things and show freedom to them. Like, yeah, we respect the president because our freedom hinges on that we share a common goal. We
Yeah,
common prosperity, which is a popular term now. We want to develop, we want to continue to live better lives, and our government says it's going to do that, and it backs it up with policies, and it backs it up with a real record of that. And so, freedom to us, that's what it looks like. It looks like we have a government that serves us, and so we're not going to go
yeah,
around saying screw Donald Trump. Well, in the United States, it's a lot different because of the realities on the ground, right? There is a big gap between what the government says and does.
yeah,
And then we're fed all of this propaganda, right? And it's both in the we're the best in the world, and also then normalizing crimes, like normalizing war crimes, normalizing political, economic corruption, right? That's a big part of it as well, to say that, yeah, okay, we're the best in the world. And then also don't forget that sanctions are a great policy, that they actually help deter aggression, when in reality, sanctions only cause further damage to economies and, more importantly, the people in the countries that are being sanctioned. And so, I think that that's a big part of this whole problem that we're in with Russia and Ukraine, is that,
yeah,
yes, there are legitimate security concerns, and of course there are risks. And I think that uh, that's why, we can't support a violation of the UN Charter wholesale. We can't say that it's correct, and we'll never know. We can't know in the moment. That's the thing too, is
yeah,
that Americans have a lot of this. We know, right? We know what exactly is going on in the heads of the Russian government. We know exactly what's going on. It's like, no, we don't. We don't exactly know what the strategy is here.
yeah,
And of course, that means also we just have to play our part. We can't condone any, civilian casualties. That is a tragedy. But we also know that, unfortunately, Ukraine's military has a hand in these civilian casualties, and Ukraine's government too, because they are going along with what the US wants. Ukraine
right,
could say, all right, this is too much. We don't want this. Let's come to the table. And given Russia's prior behavior, it's likely that Russia would say, okay, this is great. Let's talk. They tried in Belarus, they tried on the Belarusian border
right,
to do that. And it went absolutely nowhere, because you had at the same time Zelensky being portrayed as this incredible hero fighting with the people, and all these fake images going out. And meanwhile, he's arming children and like ordinary people, and he's sending them off with these right-wing groups. And you have NBC literally being caught just hanging out with the
right,
Azov battalion, right? Training grandmas to shoot guns. It's like, is that how you respond to the urgent need to diplomacy, for
right,
diplomacy? Like, no, this is only pouring gasoline on a flame, right? And I think, you know it's so important that we tie all of this together, that, this is a new Cold War precipitated conflict. We've had years and years now,
Yeah.
arguably since the second term of the Obama era, where the United States has shifted its military priorities to the east, toward China, toward Russia, and that even incidents, right, like the 2011 invasion and destruction of Libya, the intervention against Libya, Syria as well, and we can go down to Afghanistan, that
Yeah.
only ended a little while ago, and it's still ongoing in some important respects economically and covertly. And so you have all these flashpoints of outright US military aggression via NATO and otherwise. And in a new War situation, there are going to be, unfortunately, incidents like these that we can't predict, because I didn't predict. I don't think anybody predicted this could have happened.
Yeah.
But now I think we need to understand the lesson of, if the foremost military power in the world is moving toward a scenario of confrontation with the two biggest world powers, Russia and China, in various respects, competitors, right? We can call them peer competitors, so to
Right.
speak. Moving toward aggression towards them, then we can only expect, like the first Cold War, right, that there
Yeah.
will be these interventions. There will be these points of outright hostilities, over hostilities, that only cause humanitarian disasters and crises. In the first Cold War, a lot of it, most of it, was the U.S. just saying, "Okay, we're going to contain communism by destroying Korea, moving in on China, destroying Vietnam." Going to place to place to place, going all over Latin America and the African continent, and meddling in affairs there, right? Coups and
Yeah.
proxy wars and various things. And so, with that history and with that knowledge, in a new Cold War scenario, we can then say, okay, our part is, no matter what we think of Russia's decision here and policies, and we can say that there are a lot of risks that Russia has taken that you pointed out. There are consequences to any kind of actions like these that have already negatively impacted Russia. But our part is to, okay, we can play the role of demanding that the source of this hostility and tension
Yeah.
be diminished to the point where there is more political space for Russia, Ukraine, and China. Really, I don't see the U.S. and NATO being a viable diplomatic partner in any respect. So, if the only way that those countries can work things out and to
Yeah.
make sure that there's a status quo that doesn't include, uh, a bombardment of Ukraine, or
Yeah.
or sanctions against Russia, is for there to be real diplomatic talks that are unhindered by outside forces, right? Because the U.S. and NATO, they don't really have that. In any legitimate sense of international law, they shouldn't even be, especially the United States, shouldn't even be a party to anything that goes on in Ukraine politically, right?
Right.
Politically, the US has unfortunately shaped events there to such a degree, starting with the coup, and even before that, pouring money into civil society groups. There was a color revolution in 2004 that the US was a heavy hand in.
Right.
So unfortunately, the U.S. has played this role of uh, uh, meddler and foreign aggressor, that I think really needs to be at the center of how we can play our part in resolving this. And then, as things progress, we'll know more about everything that has occurred. We'll know, we're starting to see some of the more tragic consequences of this on both sides in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Yeah.
But we can then have a better understanding of this moment of history that is moving faster than I think anyone in the United States or even in the West can really keep up with,
Yeah.
especially given the pace and the onslaught of propaganda that we hear, that
Yeah.
just distorts everything, right?
For sure.
Ukraine is the hero and Russia is the villain, and that's all you need to know. And we're going to keep sending weapons,
Yeah.
enhancing sanctions, and worsening the problem. That prevents us from then saying, okay, how do we play a part in a real peaceful resolution?
Yeah. No, Danny, it's been an awesome chat with you today, and I've really excited, to have you on the channel for the first time. We'll definitely have to do this again. We still got
Yeah,
some time. I wanted to answer a few
sure.
questions. Got a couple super chats from Mr. E. Thank you for that super chat and the support. Also from Peg, thank you for the super sticker, and guys, thanks for everybody for being with us today. We've had close to 900 people in this chat, watching us, and it's been awesome to clarify some positions, to discuss this more. As many of you who follow this channel know that I'm very pro dialogue. I think we have to have this. There's a lot of interesting questions coming in, and I think one of them was, you think, for example, French President Macron, he said, Manzana said that maybe that him and Putin could work something out, and you've already seen France talking with Russia, trying to resolve. I think France has been very progressive in this. For example, Macron was the first one that came out and said France will not be doing a diplomatic boycott for Beijing
Yeah.
2022. The reason for that is that it's completely useless. And what we would like to do is actually engage in dialogue to, further, if we're going to have an issue, and that just makes so much sense. I mean, you think about the political boycott with the Olympics. If you have an issue with somebody, ignoring them and turning your back and walking the other way, it's not going to resolve it, right? If you have an issue, go there, sit down with the people and have a chat. I really respected France for saying, look, I'd rather go to Beijing and let's have a chat with China's government. We need dialogue, right? And when you talk about China, US, and our struggles in our relationship, I always say, we have to have more engagement. We have to have more dialogue. The more that we
Mm,
split, the bigger the problem gets. And so I think that's a really good statement there with France and what they're doing. There's a couple things. I think, what was it? Was Cyrus? This is from G Shepherd. Why can't you and other YouTubers get your agenda on a show like the Today Show and other mainstream media? I think that's a very easy answer for that. Is that there's a lot of censorship. There's a lot of people don't want to hear an objective view about China. The United States, for example, they have a very structured view of how China needs to be viewed. And unfortunately, right now it's moving towards that China is the biggest threat in the world, or that China is the biggest threat to the United States democracy, which I don't believe in either of those statements. I think it's nice that we have platforms like YouTube that we can come on and have a bit of independence, and that's why you see a very large growth in the need of independent YouTubers, people like
mhm.
Danny, who's independent media, who runs a Patreon account, who runs his, who produces content, because you're not necessarily going to see that in, these mainstream media publications. I think, that's just unfortunately, that's the reality. Here's an interesting thing, Danny. I don't know if you saw this on the side chat on YouTube.
Mhm.
Um, so I've been flipping back between StreamYard, which is the software that we use for this, and also I'm looking at YouTube. And there's a lot of messages that have been censored by YouTube. So anything, for
Mhm.
example, if you type in NATO and there's some type of negative connotation towards NATO, that gets censored on here. So what I see is from YouTube, it basically says this
Right.
comment is potentially sensitive. We have hidden this comment. And I have the
Wow.
option to, as the owner of this stream, I can say show, I can
Right.
show it, but basically it censors it first, as they flag that for potential, you know, a violation of or potential sensitive, too sensitive. Actually,
Yes.
anything, and I haven't been able to look at every one, and there's a lot of comments coming in, so I haven't been able to objectively click each one. But you can see there's already,
Yeah.
if again, like Danny, you've said, like this really, the U.S. and NATO, they need to be involved in the resolution of this conflict, right? Whether that
Yeah.
means that they need to retreat, or that they need to sit down with Putin and find a suitable solution, whether that's
Yeah.
establishing a neutral Ukraine, whether that is annexing these Donbas regions and giving that to Russia. I mean, there's many ways that this could essentially resolve, but we don't know. So again, that's where the pro
Yeah.
dialogue and pro engagement really needs to come.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you bring up such great points because this is something that affects me as well, right? This censorship. I mean, the reaction. I've had so many friends who work for RT America lost their jobs because of the way that the censorship over these platforms, and not just these platforms, but the way that sanctions impact the ability for the the side of like the Russian side or even the Chinese side, right? Because this has also come down on China's media platforms as well, right? There is a lot of negative reaction. It's both cutting people out like ourselves from being able to access broader audiences and then also targeting institutions that give China's side of the story or Russia's side of the story. This has been a big problem now, and it's been a big problem for the last, especially the last 6 years here in the US. And it happens so subtly, right? It's both the direct ways that comments are being censored on YouTube, and then also it happens in the ways of, well, if we post on Twitter, we post an article on our publications, then when we talk about certain things like NATO, like the history of U.S. interventions, like new Cold War in China, then that's flagged, right? And then it's pushed down in algorithms. So we have a lot of issues that this new Cold War that the U.S. presents, and it does prevent dialogue because it creates now sort of like how the U.S. is creating camps in the world again, right? The so-called autocratic camp and the so-called democratic camp. You're creating camps in society where we have people who want the truth and want to spread objective analysis, give the other side, have real discussions about real resolutions to these problems that involve everybody and that can lead to really positive changes. You have those forces being kind of siloed and sectioned off while the dominant narrative, right, gets all of the attention and even the most heinous form of the dominant narrative, right? It should be that Ukraine, in Ukraine, the Azov battalion, with all of its influence in the Ukraine National Guard, that it goes viral when it tweets out these horrific messages about greasing bullets with pig lard in order to shoot Chechen soldiers, Muslim soldiers,
Right.
like that. That goes viral because that's pushed, right? That's pushed out in the algorithm. While people like us who are saying, "Oh no, we need a peaceful resolution to prevent these kind of groups from pouring gasoline on the fire," we need our voices end up being marginalized, and so it's part of this new Cold War, and it's a really important element of it because it divides us up and creates huge gaps of knowledge and reinforces by default American exceptionalist attitudes, right? It goes all the way back to the beginning. If you silo
Yeah.
and section off people who are just trying to question and just trying to be part of a positive peaceful solution, who we're not calling for violence. I'm a socialist, but here I know the objective situation. We need to move towards steps that involve people to decide and determine, ordinary people decide to determine how things should go. We need institutions that do that. But a lot of the resources for such a positive movement and positive change are limited by those who want to see endless wars continue and want to see this runaway inequality continue and want to see things like racism continue, right? Like they have
Yeah.
uh, excess power to make that happen, and so it's really important that, yeah, and I love working together with people like yourself and
Yeah.
others because we all need to work together to make sure that we support each other and support the work that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's where I really like to have a very open mind. I mean, I'm one always for dialogue, communication. I like to also invite people from different sides of the political spectrum because I think unfortunately, as an American, this is what I've noticed in our society is that we become so polarized that
Mhm.
unfortunately Republicans don't want to hang out with Democrats and Democrats don't want to hang out with Republicans. It's become so divided. This was very different when I was growing up in America. I mean, you had your political differences, and I feel that Canada's a little bit better in that regard. We have the conservative and the liberal parties here in Canada, which are the two most dominant. But generally speaking, Canadians have, like we're Canadian at the end of the day. Yeah, you can, you're on the political spectrum. You're okay. You're left. I'm right. You're a little bit closer to that balance. Whereas in America, it's so far removed, and it's just, I have many friends that have lost friends because like, well, he's a liberal now. I don't talk to him. Like, well, why
Mm.
why do you let that dictate your friendship? That's not healthy. At the end of the day, I mean, Republicans and Democrats, they both want America to be a better place. They just have different ways to go about that. But it's also the system. Our system doesn't allow that. I mean, if we really wanted that, we would be reducing our military exposure around the world. We would be not investing as much in. And I mean, you look at the infrastructure problems we have in the United States. I mean, it's like, well, we don't have the budget for that, but yet we spend almost $1 trillion around the world, on military. So it's like, well, we do, we just don't allocate it. It's just not a priority. It's
Right.
that's unfortunate. Let's do, this has been so good, Danny. We wanted to talk for an hour, then we said 90 minutes. Now we're pressing. So this really shows a great interest. We'll definitely have to do this again.
Yeah.
There was a really good question, Danny, and it was to you. This will be our last one, guys.
Okay.
And I just got to find it. It's so many questions coming in. This is from Johan. Question to Danny. I think Russia should reduce its dependence on Western imports, develop its own products, social media networks, and innovation, just as China does. Do you agree?
Well, short of trying to dictate what Russia does in its own affairs, I mean, in my personal opinion, yes. I mean, and this has been a trend in Russian society. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, right? Whether we believe it's the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, right? There were lots of catastrophes, unfortunately, in the 20th century, right? 3 million people were killed in Korea by U.S. bombs, and
Yeah.
the intervention there. That's a catastrophe. And the same goes for, of course, all the people that died. 27 million Soviets, 20 million, 10 to 20 million Chinese in World War II. I mean, those are huge catastrophes. But and one of the reasons why it was is because the former Soviet Union uh, went into a policy called shock therapy that was supported by Europe and the U.S. and, of course, these newfound oligarchs in Russia that were just siphoning up all of the assets that were once state owned, and they just took it all for themselves and created a real problem of scarcity, of hunger, of poverty, and the lack of access to basic services, which collapsed the society to the point where people were dying of unintended deaths, premature deaths at a rate that is unprecedented in peacetime. And so Russia has stabilized quite a bit because it has taken a more independent position in terms
Yeah.
of its foreign policy and its economic policy. It has began to reassert state intervention in the economy to stabilize things, to ensure that some basic services are met, to ensure
Yeah.
that its energy is distributed around the world and coming back in terms of revenue in a way that benefits more people than just a tiny few oligarchs. Although economic problems definitely remain and have been exacerbated by all of these sanctions, which began in 2014, right? When
Yeah.
the US sanctioned Russia over Crimea, and now has intensified to the point that seeing now that this question is being asked, right? Shouldn't it
Yeah.
do this? Because we even saw pictures, right? Images online of people in Russia not able to use Google Pay and these kind of
Correct. Exactly.
Western corporations. They can't use them for transportation. Now everything is being delayed. So if you have if you have thousands of people delayed in just moving, you have the potential, even just that alone creates economic shockwaves
It does.
that are going to be felt. And so for me, I do think that Russia, I agree with that opinion, right? That it needs to be that. I think that it's just going to happen because Russia is now in has no choice. And this is a longstanding pattern since 2014 and even earlier, where Russia wants to be more closer to Europe, wants to have closer relationship with Europe and the US economically. But the US and Europe are saying, oh, we're willing to sacrifice some of that. Europe to a lesser degree, US to the extreme degree. We're willing to sacrifice that partnership for geopolitical and military aims. And that means that Russia has had to pursue a more independent policy. I think the Russia China partnership is not necessarily predicated just on a response to outside aggression, but it has definitely accelerated because of that and has been a really positive thing. So I do think that, yeah, Russia can learn a lot from China because Alipay, WeChat, these institutions are sanctions proof because they are not dictated by whatever Western corporations who invest in the country do when their governments tell them it's time to squeeze the country. That
Yeah.
is much less possible in China than maybe anywhere else in the world, really, given China's position, its ability to regulate and determine how its economy functions in relation to the larger global situation. And it's also why China has been able to really respond to things like the 2007 2008 economic crisis in a way that's very resilient, right? It had, of course, an effect on China, but China still was able to maintain economic growth during the pandemic, still able to maintain economic growth because it has that sovereignty portion of it. And I think Russia
Yeah,
does not have that same degree of sovereignty over its economy. It's much more dependent upon Europe, much more dependent upon the
yeah,
United States for its internal economic development. And that's a product of the Soviet Union's fall.
agreed.
That's a product of that 10-year period that just completely decimated the economy.
Yeah, good, well said there. And I'm going to end it on this one, just to share my thoughts. I think when you look at Russia and being so dependent, this really shows, for example, one of the most brilliant things that China ever did was install the Great Firewall of China, because what they've been able to do is develop domestically. They have all of their own, Alipay, WeChat Pay. Basically they're not dependent on, even for social media, right? If you go to Europe, right, Facebook controls the vast majority of social networks. So I mean, that's a very dangerous position. If you're, for example, France, and you have Facebook, which the overwhelming percentage of your population uses Facebook. Well, that's an American company that's controlled by that. The United States, China never wanted to give the U.S. that kind of power, because we know, and this is, if you've watched the movie, the Social Dilemma, former Facebook executive, if you've ever wanted to cause more political distress in a country, there's never been a better tool invented than Facebook.
Mm.
And because we can essentially, especially in these smaller countries, like something like a Guatemala, right? We can go in there with Facebook ads. We can turn that election however we want through social media and manipulation. And that's a very dangerous point. I mean, this is the danger of social media, but it's also, why, for example, China has very aggressive policies, towards this, because they want to make sure. And again, this has all started. I was in China when Facebook and Google and YouTube were allowed. This was in
Mm.
2007. All of these were open in China. And I don't know if many people know the backstory on that, but the reason why that got banned is that Xinjiang terrorist groups were using Facebook to
Right.
organize their activities. And China came in and said, look, terrorists are committing terrorist acts inside our own borders against Chinese nationals, and they are using an American social media website to organize it. You need to give the data. Facebook says, sorry, that's privacy policy. We can't give you that data. And you know what? China's like, well, that's fine. You know what? Banned. And we're not, because we cannot affect our integrity, and we can't have an American company dictating what's happening inside our own borders. I think you're
Yeah.
only going to see more of that in the future. But Danny, we've had an amazing stream, almost
Yeah.
2 hours now of chatting together. I think we've
Yeah.
we've had an amazing amount of support from everybody. I want to thank you. I want to thank everybody for being in the chat, and all of the amazing questions that have come here. And everybody, I think, again, pro dialogue, pro engagement is really, really important. And yeah, thank you all for being here. We'll see you in the next
Yeah.
episode.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. And this was a great conversation. So thanks, Cyrus, for being up for it.
You got it. All right, guys. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks, Danny. And we'll see you all. Take care.